Welcome to Relax Story, a place where gentle stories help you leave behind the noise of the day and slowly drift into a peaceful sleep. Each soft, soothing narration is designed to relax your mind, release tension, and guide you to a deeper sense of calm within. If you enjoy the experience, don't forget to like and subscribe to stay with Relax Story every night. Feel free to leave a comment, to share your thoughts, or suggest a story you would love to hear. Now, close your eyes, take a deep breath, and let Relax Story guide you into a restful, deep sleep. I was born when the black water began to rise again through the low flooded forest in the southwestern Amazon. No moonlight reached that place. Only damp cold gathered beneath the giant roots of a kapok tree leaning over the water's edge. Thick exposed roots held together the soft ground, already drinking the first rains of the season. Beneath them lingered a darkness heavy with cold mud and rotting leaves. That was where my mother kept us, above the water, above the rain, and away from the unfamiliar scents drifting through the black river. I could not see anything yet. The first world was only heat moving slowly beneath my mother's wet fur. Her body sealed the narrow den beneath the roots. Each time she breathed in, the soft earth trembled faintly beneath my stomach. Water dripped from the roots into the mud with a slow and steady rhythm. The smell of flooded soil mixed with warm milk and rain-soaked fur became the only thing my body recognized. I did not understand distance. I did not understand darkness. I did not understand direction. There was only the pressure of my mother's body surrounding me like warm water that never stopped moving. Beside me, another small body pushed harder than mine. It found the milk faster. Whenever I drifted away from my mother's belly, cold immediately flooded through the thin wet fur covering my skin. My legs curled inward on instinct. Then my mother's rough tongue dragged me back toward the familiar heat. She licked the mud and rainwater from our backs, while her ears kept turning toward the forest beyond the roots. Every time she shifted her weight, the soft ground trembled again. My body twitched before I understood why. Slowly, I began to learn the shape of warmth, to follow the scent of milk, to press against heat whenever the earth beneath us changed. Beyond the kapok roots, the forest never stopped moving. Insects vibrated endlessly around the black water. Tree frogs released short, dull calls between waves of heavy rain striking the broad leaves overhead. Water slipped through the roots in small, dark rhythms. The Amazon at night was never silent. It breathed through thousands of layered sounds beneath the first rains of the wet season. I did not understand sound yet, but my body was beginning to remember it. The rhythm of rain on white leaves, my mother's heartbeat beneath thick fur, small vibrations spreading through flooded ground. Then suddenly, part of the forest disappeared. The insects near the waterline stopped first. After that came a silence so brief that my mother's body tightened immediately around us. Her shoulders lifted. Her legs closed slightly against our sides. Nothing inside the den moved anymore. A breath of water sounded very close in the darkness. There was no shape, only the soft movement of water between the roots. A heavy pressure traveled through the mud beneath my stomach. My mother's heartbeat changed. Slower, heavier. I pressed deeper beneath the warmth of her body. Instinct forced me still. The air inside the den became thick and wet. Then the sound moved away. Water shifted farther into the darkness beyond the roots. The insects slowly returned in layers around the flooded forest. My mother's shoulders lowered again. Familiar heat spread back across my body. I did not understand rain. I did not understand danger. But my body had already begun remembering the first truth of its life. Safety carried my mother's scent. And above the flooded kapok roots, the rain continued thickening across the great leaves of the Amazon night. Many days later, while the water kept rising through the low forest, my eyes finally began to open beneath the cold smell of black mud and river water. Two weeks after I was born, the forest began to change its scent. Rain fell through many nights without stopping, and the black water climbed higher around the giant kapok roots outside the den. Soft mud spread closer to where my mother usually rested. The air grew heavier, wetter. Each breath filled my throat with the smell of rotting leaves and the cold, stagnant water that had lingered too long beneath the flooded forest. Insects breeding after the rain covered the darkness with a thin layer of vibration that never truly stopped. I opened my eyes during that time. Light had no clear shape yet. Everything was only dark masses moving slowly against one another. Pale patches trembled and disappeared. The den entrance looked like a dim pool of brightness where shadows constantly drifted past. My sight was still weak. I did not understand distance. I did not understand form. Only movement felt real. Outside the den, the water trembled beneath rain still falling from the high canopy far above. Small ripples touched the mud around the roots and vanished. Sometimes, something changed the direction of the water. A long dark shape passed through the dull reflection near the den entrance before slipping back into deeper blackness. I could not see them clearly yet, but my body was beginning to understand that the world beyond my mother's warmth never stayed still. The smell of the den changed too as my mother began leaving more often. Feeding two cubs drained heat from her body. I felt it whenever I pressed against the thick fur beneath her stomach and listened to the heavy rhythm inside her chest. When she left to hunt, warmth disappeared quickly from the wet roots around us. Darkness widened immediately. The forest grew louder. Every drop of water falling from above sounded close enough to touch my ears. My sibling and I stumbled through the cold mud, biting at one another while searching for the fading scent of milk. Hunger tightened my body in short waves. I did not understand time yet, but I was beginning to remember the long, hollow feeling inside my stomach whenever my mother did not return. Sometimes the black water outside the den touched the fur beneath my belly. My body jerked instantly. Cold. The cold of forest water was different from the night air. Heavier, slower, as if something pressed against my skin and stayed there. One night, beneath a thin rain, the water near the den began moving in a different way. Not the vibration of insects, not the touch of rain. A low, slow movement spread through the flooded edge beneath the roots. I lifted my head from the mud. Two small lights floated on the black water. Only eyes and nostrils rested above the surface. Everything else remained hidden beneath the dark reflection of the flooded forest. A young black caiman lay motionless near the water's edge. I did not understand predators yet. I did not understand ambush. but I could feel the strange cold scent drifting from the still water around it. Different from dead fish, different from rotting leaves. It smelled like mud, buried too long, beneath a place where light never reached. Farther away, small ripples kept appearing around the body of a decaying fish near the bank. Young piranhas snapped beneath the black water, creating quick, sharp vibrations before vanishing again when the surface grew still. The forest was no longer only rain and my mother's breathing. Something else was alive beneath that water. Something watched from the darkness where I could not see clearly. That night, my mother returned after the air had grown much colder. Her scent arrived before the sound of her steps. Wet mud, river water, and another smell beneath them. Hotter, sharper. It tightened my throat the moment I breathed it in. Blood. She dragged a young capybara behind her, its soft skull broken open. Warm blood mixed with rainwater and flowed through the mud around the den. I pressed my nose against the wet fur of the dead body. Heat still lingered beneath the flesh. The slow, heavy sound of bone crushing echoed beneath my mother's jaws. I heard it clearly. She pulled the carcass deeper beneath the roots and covered part of it with mud. The smell of wet earth immediately dulled the scent of blood spreading through the air. Carrion flies had not arrived yet, but even blood could not hide what was moving closer beyond the den. Night deepened. The insects faded little by little, as though the darkness itself was swallowing its own sounds. The water outside barely moved now. Slow, heavy. Then the scent appeared. Wet, cold, thick like stagnant water left unmoving beneath rotting leaves for too long. My mother raised her head immediately. Her body blocked the den entrance completely. One foreleg pressed us lower into the cold mud. I heard her heartbeat change, slower, heavier. Outside, the mud trembled softly beneath something long moving through the water. I did not know what an anaconda was. I did not understand that some bodies could grow longer than young trees and remain perfectly still beneath black water for hours at a time. But my body began remembering something new. Water could hide living things. Before dawn came, my mother moved the den for the first time. One by one, she carried us by the back of the neck through the dark, flooded forest. Cold water covered my stomach with every step she took. Strange vibrations traveled from the surface into her body, then into mine. The darkness was no longer empty. Cold mud, fresh blood, still water. All of it settled inside me like a new layer of memory from the black water forest. And from that night forward, every dark place ahead carried the feeling that something inside it was breathing. After many days of rain, the forest floor no longer stayed still beneath my belly. Places that once held the dry scent of rotting leaves softened into cold mud, then slowly disappeared beneath the heavy black water. The old den still carried my mother's smell. Old warmth still lingered between the roots. But outside, the world had changed shape. Narrow paths around the shelter vanished piece by piece, where my claws once found solid ground. There was now only dark water, flat and unreadable. Fallen trunks floated like wet backs, breaking the surface. Roots curved out of the mud, slick and black. Small patches of earth drifted apart from one another, like scraps of skin left behind on a forest slowly being eaten by water. My mother no longer stayed in the den for long. Her body stood at the entrance, low and heavy, silent as a familiar shadow. When she moved, I followed. I did not know where she was leading me. I did not yet know which smells belonged to things that could be caught, things that should be avoided, things that could be eaten. I only knew the damp fur behind her legs, the slow sway of her tail between the roots, and the sound of her paws finding the last hard places beneath the flood. When she stopped, I stopped. When she lowered herself close to the ground, my own belly pressed against the cold roots. The world beyond the den was wider, but less certain. The air felt wetter, deeper. Every breath carried the smell of newly disturbed mud. High above us, the canopy never stayed quiet. Howler monkeys sent long, heavy calls through the layers of leaves, stretching distance until it no longer made sense. Sound moved through trunks, through moisture, through the dark spaces between branches, then returned changed from the way it began. Sometimes the calls felt far away. Sometimes they seemed directly above my head. I looked upward. My mother did not. She only stopped when the sharp cry of a bird tore across the canopy. Macaws beat their wings high overhead, knocking leaves into the water one by one. My mother froze. The forest around her seemed to freeze with her. I learned this with my body before I understood anything else. When the sounds above changed direction, the legs had to stop. When the mud breathed too softly beneath the claws, the body had to pull back. When roots remained dry, the paws belonged there, not in the darker places beside them. Then the roots ended. Ahead of my mother stretched a strip of black water, leading toward another patch of mud. A fallen trunk leaned between the two raised banks, but its middle had already sunk beneath the surface. My mother stepped in first. The water opened around her chest without changing her rhythm. Her dark golden fur soaked deeper in color. Her head stayed high. Her ears stayed low. Her shoulders slid through the current as if it were only another curtain of wet leaves. I stood on the fallen trunk, claws digging into the slick, rotten bark. My mother's scent entered the water and thinned apart. It did not disappear, but it no longer rested in the air the way it had before. It drifted lower now, colder, mixed with drowned roots and leaves soaked for too many days. When my front paws touched the water, it bit into the skin beneath my belly. My fur grew heavy almost instantly. My legs found no ground. My claws scraped through soft emptiness. My body sank lower than it wanted to. The insects behind me, the birds, the dripping leaves, all of it suddenly moved farther away, as if pushed behind a wall of thick mud. Inside the water, I heard my own breathing more clearly, the rush beside my ears, the faint vibrations from my mother's body moving ahead of me. She did not turn back immediately. She let the water touch me. She let the current pull lightly around my legs. She let my body learn that the forest did not always exist beneath the claws. Some parts of the forest did not hold. Some parts drifted. To my left, several large brown shapes moved slowly along a floating patch of grass near the water's edge. They lowered their heads, lifted them again, pressing close together with the smell of wet grass and warm skin. I watched them, but no shape of prey existed inside me yet. Only a mark remained. Large bodies could live beside the water. Above us, birds cried again. Farther out in the cloudy water, a small movement twitched across the surface. then vanished. Beneath that black layer, bodies existed without needing to appear. The water kept them hidden inside its shadow. Water blinded, water buried scent. Water swallowed even the bath's sound tried to follow. I began moving faster to stay close behind my mother. One paw landed on the submerged part of the fallen trunk. The bark slipped beneath my claws. My body tilted sideways. For one short breath, my mother's scent disappeared from in front of me, and water rushed over my face. Cold filled my ears. Water filled my nose. My paws struck downward but found no bottom. My mother's footsteps vanished. The forest vanished. Only a deep, heavy hum remained, pressing against my skull from every side. I opened my mouth. Water entered. My chest tightened hard. All four legs pushed into darkness without shape. No roots, no mud, no bank. Only the current pulling my body sideways, away from the direction that smelled like my mother. Then something sharp seized the back of my neck. My mother's teeth closed around the loose skin there, the same place she had carried me when I was smaller. My body lifted backward out of the water. Air returned in broken pieces. I coughed water from my nose, from my mouth, warmer than the flood I had swallowed. My paws struck mud, slipped, then found roots. My mother placed me onto a low rise of earth and stayed pressed against me for several breaths. Her belly was warm. Her fur was soaked too. But beneath the wetness remained the old scent of the den, of faded milk, of the mud where I once slept. She did not stay long. When my breathing stopped breaking apart, she stood and moved forward again. I followed behind her, lower than before, heavier than before. Water dripped slowly from my fur onto the roots below. From that moment on, the smell of black water no longer belonged only outside the den. It had entered my nose, my chest, the fur beneath my skin. It pulled things away, but it also carried things through. It erased sound, yet still held the vibrations of my mother moving ahead of me. Inside that cold darkness, I learned another mark of the forest. The places that held danger could also hold a path. And the places where paths began could swallow a call before it ever returned. Later, when the water retreated slightly and the mud along the riverbank began to show beneath the roots again, that smell still clung to my body. The smell of black water, the smell of cold, the smell of my mother thinning inside the current. And where the fresh mud opened beside the river, something waited there without breath, waiting for my young claws to touch it. Near the end of the rainy season, the black water began slowly pulling away from the trees it had drowned for many days. Soft ground emerged beneath tangled roots. The mud held the trapped warmth of earth, sealed underwater for too long. Every step sinking into it released the smell of leaves compressed deep below the surface. The air beside the river stayed thick and wet. Pools of still water rested between low mounds of mud, reflecting dull gray light drifting through the canopy overhead. My mother led me away from the familiar roots, while the water still carried the restless movements of the night. Her body moved lower and slower than usual. Her ears kept shifting toward the small sounds of water slipping between newly exposed banks of mud. I followed behind her, my belly nearly touching the soft ground. The smell of black water still clinging to the wet fur across my chest. Then I smelled it. It was not the scent of milk, beneath my mother's body. Not the smell of fresh blood spreading into cold water after a quick bite beneath flooded roots. This smell was heavier, thicker, sweet and rotten at the same time, as though heat itself were leaking from inside the mud. The closer we moved, the denser the insects became. A large body lay trapped near the edge of the mud bank, half submerged in cloudy water, half resting on soft earth still marked by the old current. Its skin stretched tight beneath the wet light. The parts touched by water had darkened. One hind leg twisted awkwardly where a narrow trunk pinned it against the shore. I pressed my nose against the cold hide. Nothing answered, no small tightening beneath the flesh, no vibration returning into my muzzle. Only soft coldness and the smell of something inside escaping through tiny openings around the eyes and mouth. Flies crowded thick around the head of the dead thing. They moved together in a low, restless layer close to the mud. I heard tiny wings touching wet flesh, heard water tapping softly against the swollen belly caught beside the riverbank. Sometimes a bubble of trapped gas rose from beneath the cloudy water around the body, then burst slowly against the mud. My mother did not move closer yet. Her body stayed low. Her head remained near her shoulders. Her smell changed when the wind shifted from the mud bank toward us. I noticed her ears turning more often toward the water than toward the dead body itself. Other creatures arrived before I even lifted my nose away from the cold hide. Flies gathered thick around the eyes and the softer places already opening apart. They covered them like moving black skin. Farther along the mud bank, an armadillo stepped out from the rotting leaves. It did not approach the large body at the shore. Its long snout lowered again and again into the soft mud, digging lightly where the smell of insects and larvae grew strongest. Higher above us, large shadows changed places among the lower branches. I heard claws gripping bark before I saw them. Big birds waited at a distance from the mud bank. Their heads stayed almost perfectly still, while their eyes remained fixed on the dead tapir below. One dropped lower than the others. Its wings spread wide enough to make the wet air around me tremble softly. That was when my body first began to understand something. Places carrying the smell of decay pulled other movements toward them. Things that no longer breathed could still awaken the mud around them. My mother still had not stepped forward. Her belly stayed above the ground. Her front paws held firm against the harder mud near the roots. The wind shifted again. I smelled old water, birds, soft flesh opening beneath wet heat, and beneath it all, a faint reptile smell lingering near the water behind the dead body. Then large wings suddenly dropped too close. A group of vultures landed hard on the mud bank ahead of me. The air shook beneath heavy low wing beats. Cold mud splashed across my front legs. One wing swept just above my head, and the fur along my spine lifted before I even understood why. My throat tightened on its own. My mouth opened. A sound burst from my chest. It was not deep like my mother's, not long enough to shake the water, but it made the birds hesitate for several short breaths. I felt my throat vibrating beneath the wet fur. My front paws pressed deeper into the soft mud. Heat passed through my teeth and vanished into the rotting air around the dead tapir. Then the wings shifted away again, only slightly. Not long after, the birds returned to the carcass when no attack followed. Flies still covered the tapir's head. The armadillo kept digging through the nearby mud. water continued tapping softly against the body trapped beside the shore. The mud bank did not grow quieter after the first sound that left my throat. But from that day forward, I remembered clearly the smell of rotting flesh beneath the wet heat at the end of the rainy season. I remembered the heavy wings beating close above my head. I remembered the feeling of my throat vibrating when sound first forced its way out of my body. Death did not become an idea inside me. It became a smell, a place, a cluster of sounds living inside the mud beside the black water. And when the dry season began pulling the river farther away from the flooded lowlands, the small bodies along the banks no longer remained long enough to find. Some days, my belly tightened before the sun disappeared behind the canopy. Hunger had begun moving inside my body, like something with its own breathing rhythm. The water began pulling away from the low forest where I had been born. Black roots that once slept beneath the surface now pushed through soft mud that smelled cold and sour. During the day, the air grew heavier. Heat gathered between the low trunks and the layers of leaves slowly drying beneath them. But when darkness spilled down from the high canopy, the cold arrived faster than before. The water that once held warmth near the den had retreated far away. Each time I curled against my mother's belly to sleep, I could feel the heat leaving my fur more quickly. The sounds around the water changed too. Fewer fish breaking the surface, fewer collapses of mud beneath capybara feet. Old smells still clung to the ground, but new movement became harder to find. More often, I smelled footprints that had already dried long ago before I smelled living breath. Mother began leaving the den before darkness fully thickened, and returning only when the first gray light slipped between the giant ceiba trunks. Once, she came back without blood on her jaws. No smell of hot meat, only old water, mud drying along her shoulders, and a long, heavy breath dragging through her throat. The space between feedings began to stretch longer. The emptiness inside my belly did not feel like pain. It felt like a cold hollow buried deep inside my body. When I slept, my legs sometimes twitched hard enough to wake me. Sleep broke apart into short pieces. I could hear insects striking leaves, water falling from roots, ants moving beneath the rotting wood near the den. The other one heard them too. We began biting each other for places closer to Mother's belly. Our teeth were not strong enough to tear skin, but they held now. Small growls had begun forming in our throats. My body reacted faster to movement than before. Even a falling leaf could send my front paws lifting from the mud, but the other one slowed down. He slept longer between Mother's returns. His belly no longer stayed full after feeding. Sometimes I pushed ahead of him, and he no longer pushed back. His breathing became so light that I only felt it when I lay pressed against him. One night, while Mother still had not returned, I began chewing the dried remains of something near the den entrance. Bitter earth and old blood clung to small bones, then insects, slow beetles beneath wet leaves. I did not understand what I was searching for. There was only dryness in my throat and a jaw that wanted to close around something softer than air. My body was beginning to learn something else. Following Mother was no longer enough. To remain alive, I had to search for warmth, for smell, for something that could stay still inside my mouth long enough to swallow. Then, the peccaries came to the dry ground beyond the flooded forest. I smelled them before I saw movement. A thick hot scent, sharp and heavy, mixed with earth constantly torn open beneath their feet. Tick birds flew low around the dry shrubs, dropping down and rising again from the moving backs farther away. Small hooves struck hard ground in steady rhythms through the roots. Mother lowered herself the moment she caught their scent. Her steps slowed. Her shoulders sank almost level with the grass. The air ahead was filled with the smell of hot animals and the packed breathing of an entire herd. I did not understand Mother's strategy. I only felt the muscles beneath her fur tightening slowly, heavily, like a tree preparing to fall. The peccaries did not scatter like capybaras. They stayed close together. Short, shrill cries moved constantly through the dry dust. Their bodies pressed so tightly beside one another that fur and mud became a single thick layer in the air. Then Mother lunged. One young peccary had drifted too far from the edge of the herd. Dry mud burst beneath Mother's feet. I heard bodies colliding, and immediately the sounds across the clearing changed. A sharp scream erupted. Then dozens more crashed together between the low trunks. The peccaries turned back. They did not flee. They did not open space. I saw low bodies rushing together through the hot dust. Their jaws opened again and again. Their shrieks thickened around Mother. Hot fur and churned mud flooded the narrow ground. Mother ripped herself free from the tightening ring around her. One adult peccary struck across her shoulder before being thrown sideways into the mud. I heard flesh hit rotten wood. Mother retreated between short bursts of movement and the pounding of hooves behind her. When she returned to the den, blood already clung to her shoulder. Not much, but enough for the fur there to harden together. She lowered herself more slowly than before. One front leg never fully touched the ground. Her breathing dragged heavily through the cold darkness of the dry season for a long time. I pressed myself against her belly, but the warmth there had grown thinner. The other one no longer pushed for space. He only lay still beside Mother, his head lowered between his front legs. When insects shifted direction outside across the mudflats, his ears twitched once, then stilled again. That night, I could not sleep for long. Army ants chewed through the rotting leaves near the den for hours, a small moving line that never stopped. Each time the sound crept closer through the soft ground, I felt my belly tighten. After that night, hunger no longer lived only inside my stomach. It had its own sounds, the shrieks of peccaries across dry mud, Mother's heavy breathing inside darkness, ants chewing beneath cooling leaves, and the sleepless hollow buried deep inside my body. In the middle of the dry season, the low stone den felt colder than the places Mother had hidden us before. The ground beneath my belly was no longer soft with water. It crumbled into small, dry, sharp grains that clung to my young fur whenever I shifted. Thin moisture still held to the stone walls, barely enough to keep a faint cold smell alive. Outside, dry bamboo rubbed against itself with soft hissing sounds. The water was farther away now, water that once breathed around the roots and carried the smell of black mud into the den, had sunk somewhere low beyond the forest, leaving behind a light, dry emptiness in the air. Mother lay near the entrance, blocking part of the wind. Her shoulders smelled of old blood. Not the smell of fresh heat spilling from torn flesh, but dry blood, sticky beneath saliva and healing skin. Sometimes she licked the wound slowly, then stopped, ears angled toward the forest. Her breathing sounded heavier than in the nights before. Her belly no longer carried the full smell of milk. Each time I pressed myself into her fur, I had to push my muzzle deeper through damp fur and earth smell to find the warmth still trapped there. My brother lay deeper inside the den, closer to Mother's belly than I was, but his body no longer pushed back against mine the way it once had. Before, if I touched him, a small paw would kick against me. A wet muzzle would shove into my neck. Sometimes he bit my ear with teeth not yet sharp enough to cut, only to keep his place near Mother. That night, when I pressed my nose against his side, I heard only one thin breath, then a long stretch of silence. His body was not warm like Mother's belly. His smell had changed too. It was still the familiar scent of young fur, but beneath it lay something faintly sour, like wet leaves left too long against cold stone. I did not know what was leaving him. I only knew that his body moved less. When Mother shifted, he did not crawl after her immediately. When her belly drifted farther away, he did not force himself closer again. He lay there with his muzzle against the ground, front legs folded weakly beneath him. I crawled closer and smelled around his nose. His breath touched my whiskers so lightly it was almost nothing. I pushed my head into his neck. No force pushed back. I bit softly at his ear, the way I had before when he would jerk awake and bite back. His ear felt soft, cold at the edges, without movement. I waited. Inside the den, there was only Mother's breathing, the cold trapped in stone, and the dry forest rubbing against itself outside. Mother turned toward him many times. Her nose touched his back, his belly, his muzzle. Her tongue pulled slowly through his thin fur again and again. Each time she licked him, the small body shifted slightly beneath the weight of her tongue, then settled still again. She pulled him closer beneath her front leg, covering him with part of her warmth. But the warmth never stayed long. It slipped through his thin fur and disappeared into the cold ground beneath him. After a very long time, Mother stood. Her body blocked the den entrance before moving away again, allowing more darkness to spill inside. She did not call. No long sound came from her throat. Her nose faced the forest, where the smells of small animals, dry mud, and broken leaves drifted low through the wind. Her wounded shoulder moved slowly as she stepped away. Her smell lingered near the den entrance for a while, thick and warm, before thinning into the dry air between the bamboo trunks. I crawled closer to the body still lying on the ground, without Mother there to block the wind. The stone beneath my paws felt colder. I pressed my side against him, but no warmth answered back. I lowered my ear beside his muzzle. No steady breathing, no damp air leaving his nose, only earth smell, wet fur, and the faint sourness growing stronger, little by little. The first movement did not come from him. A small dark shape crawled across the edge of his ear. Then another appeared near his eye. Ants moved in thin lines through the damp fur, across his ears, across the corners of his mouth, across the places where saliva had dried. I lifted a paw and touched them. A few fell away. Others climbed back again. Their sounds were smaller than rain, smaller than roots scraping against stone. but inside the still den, I could hear their tiny movement beside my ears. Outside the entrance, a dark shape swept low across the ground fast, without a clear smell, leaving only a cold current of air against my whiskers before vanishing into the night. I bit gently into the back of my brother's neck, not hard, only enough to pull him up the way we once rolled together through milk smell and warm mud. His body lifted with my jaws, soft and strangely heavy. His neck did not hold his head upright. His legs did not brace against the ground. When I released him, he folded sideways onto the cold mud near the edge of the den, head tilted awkwardly, muzzle pressed into the broken dirt. No breath escaped him, no small kick followed, no young teeth searched for my ear. I pulled again. My teeth slipped through the damp fur at the back of his neck. The weight followed me only a short distance before falling again. His neck bent softly. One back leg stretched outward and did not pull back. The ants scattered, then returned along the same paths. My breathing shortened into broken pieces inside my throat. I stood over him for a long time, ears raised, waiting for a familiar sound. But the den only returned the sound of my own breathing. Rain came back near the end of the night, very lightly. Drops touched the stone outside the den, thin and cold. The smell of new water was not strong enough to hide the changing smell of the body on the ground. I lay nearby, not fully close, not fully far away. Cold stone held beneath my belly. Ants continued crossing the wet fur of my brother. Mother had not yet returned. Outside, the dry forest remained motionless in darkness. That night did not leave behind a call inside me. It left cold ground beneath my chest, the smell of young fur no longer warm, ants moving close beside my ears, and the feeling of pulling a body that could no longer rise on its own. Long after that night, whenever water pulled away from the roots and stone rose beneath the smell of dry season, my body still recognized that cold before my eyes could find it. Some things lie down and never move again. Some breaths do not return to darkness. After that night, the water continued retreating farther away, gathering into still pools among black mud. I began following Mother beyond the den for longer distances, across dry earth and exposed roots, and beneath the unmoving water, where the forest's shadow rested thick like another layer of skin. Something larger than darkness had begun to move. Near the end of the dry season, the water pulled away from many of the smaller river branches, leaving still black pools between cracked mud and low reeds. The sound of current no longer moved through the forest day and night, like it did in the deeper waters. The air rested heavily above the pools, thick and hot, like damp skin stretched over the low forest. Old mud breathed upward from the edges of the water. The smell of stranded fish dissolved slowly beneath the sun. Blood-feeding insects drifted low across the surface in trembling layers around my ears. Mother moved ahead through reeds half sunken in mud, but the distance between us had grown longer than before. Sometimes I could no longer reach the smell of her fur with each short breath. Only the large prints pressed into the soft mud remained, along with the faint pheromone scent clinging to broken reeds close to the ground. I stopped beside a pool cut away from the main river. The black surface barely moved. Only a few thin ripples faded slowly around floating plants. The mud along the edge held many small traces. Waterbird tracks stretched in long rows. Thin silver fish scales clung to dry mud. Twisting drag marks slipped down toward the water and vanished beneath the still black surface. I lowered my body closer to the ground than before. My belly hovered just above the hot mud. My front paws settled down more slowly. Each time the mud gave softly beneath my weight, I froze until the water ahead became still again. My breaths shortened whenever something moved inside the floating reeds near the pool. The wind crossed the water before touching my whiskers. I kept my head low so my scent would not travel straight over the pool. It was not something I learned through thought. The body simply began to understand that near water, one step pressed too hard could send ripples outward. Ripples traveled very far across still water. An insect fell onto the surface, spreading small, trembling rings. A tiny fish skimmed just beneath the pool before disappearing into the darkness below. Farther out, the water swelled slightly. A large fish surfaced. A short, heavy inhale broke the surface and vanished almost immediately. Only part of its dark body appeared before sinking again. Wide ripples rolled through the floating plants, pushing dead leaves softly against one another. I watched the place where the fish had disappeared. Then another patch of water trembled. Nothing surfaced there. No breath, no large ripple. Only a black shape moving slowly beneath the reflection of the hot gray sky. Two small points opened near the surface inside the darkness. They did not blink. They did not shake. A cold smell of deep mud drifted toward me. My body stopped moving. The thing near the edge of the pool created almost no disturbance at all. Only its eyes and part of its dark snout rose above the black water. Everything else vanished beneath the silent reflection. Then the pool exploded in a single short movement. Water burst upward, hard and cold. A long black body lunged from the surface and disappeared almost immediately again. I only saw pale jaws closing around the place where the fish had surfaced moments earlier. No roar, no long chase. The water became still again very quickly. I did not understand what lived beneath the water, but my body began to remember that still surfaces could hide bodies larger than darkness beneath the reeds. On the far side of the pool, another sound broke through the heat. Short, sharp, lower than a bird call. A large otter lifted its head beside the floating plants. Wet black fur reflected thin light across the water. It looked toward me and made the sound again. At once, the pool changed. The jacanas walking across the floating leaves stopped moving. Small fish scattered into overlapping lines beneath the surface. The insects kept singing, but the movements near the water's edge became broken and uneven. I stood motionless beneath the reeds. The otter's sound did not feel like the usual calls inside the forest. It carried direction. It pushed across the water like a cold touch. I did not understand the meaning of the call, but my body understood that my position had been touched by sound. After a long while, I lowered my head toward the edge of the pool. Cold mud clung to my whiskers. The smell of still water rested close against my nose. Old ripples from the floating plants still crossed over one another in thin, trembling lines. Then the water in front of me swelled. No footsteps, no violent splash, only pressure moving through the mud beside the shore. The smell of cold mud thickened. My stomach tightened before my eyes fully understood. My ears flattened low. My hind legs exploded upward from the soft mud. Cold water struck my face and throat as a long dark body burst from the pool. My front claws tore through mud during the sideways leap. The jaws beneath the water snapped shut exactly where my head had been. I landed deep inside the low reeds, breath short and hot inside my throat. Behind me, the water shuddered several more times before settling again. The thing beneath the pool did not follow onto land. Farther out, the otter continued making short, broken sounds. The jacanas slowly returned to the floating plants, as though the pool had never opened at all. I did not go back to drink. I stood for a very long time beneath the hot reed shadows, staring at the black pool, resting between cracked mud. After that place, water no longer felt like something that simply carried bodies through the flooded forest. Beneath that still black skin, another shape could always be waiting. A body large enough to move without sound, and near water. The body had to wait longer than darkness itself. The air thickened after the first rains. The smell of old water loosened from the low mud. The shallow flooded forest where Mother once pulled me through had softened beneath my paws. Rotten leaves held moisture for a very long time. Every step pressed the dark ground downward and released the smell of spoiled fruit, wet sap, and roots slowly dissolving underneath. I no longer stayed near the pools as often as before. In this lower forest, the sounds were smaller. Leaves scratching, thin claws touching tree roots, broken bursts of running beneath low ferns. But before I began to understand those sounds, my mouth changed first. A dull ache settled deep inside my jaw. It did not disappear even when I slept beside Mother's stomach. The gums near the front of my mouth burned whenever I clenched my jaws. I began biting everything near me. Soft wood, wet root bark, old bones left behind where Mother fed. Sometimes I held dry pieces of carcass between my jaws for a very long time just to feel the hard, sharp pressure traveling through my teeth. The new teeth touched differently, sharper, heavier. My jaws wanted to close around something that could break apart. Mother began leaving less meat behind after each hunt. Sometimes she dragged prey deep into the dark roots and fed alone longer than before. I had to wait. The empty feeling inside my stomach pulled my body lower through the rotten leaves. I began watching movement along the ground instead of simply following Mother's scent. A small reddish-brown creature appeared near a fallen tree. It paused for a long time inside the wet leaves, its small head lowered close to the ground before lifting again and again. Its ears twitched lightly. Then the body jumped sideways very fast before freezing once more. I remembered the way it moved. Stop, listen, burst sideways, stop again. Mother did not lunge. She only lay low behind a large root. Her tail remained still. Her scent stayed calm. I moved forward. The first time, I sprang too early. Rotten leaves burst beneath my paws before my claws ever touched the brown fur ahead of me. The creature changed direction in the middle of my leap. I struck only wet air and the smell of torn earth. Another time, my hind paws slipped slightly across soft mud. The sound was small, but enough for the creature to vanish beneath tangled roots. My stomach remained empty. My jaw continued aching, I lunged many more times. Each failure left something behind inside my body. My hind legs compressed longer before springing. My shoulders lowered. My belly moved closer to the ground. My breathing shrank inside my throat. I stopped watching the prey's whole body. I began watching the direction its shoulders tilted before it jumped. The body changed on its own before I understood why. Above me, high broken sounds trembled through the canopy. Spider monkeys. Branches shook violently before falling silent again. Then short calls echoed through the thick leaves overhead. Sometimes an entire section of canopy trembled together, like rain running across the forest. I lifted my head upward, only for one moment. When I looked down again, the agouti had vanished from the rotten leaves. I stood still for a long time afterward. My ears still held the monkey calls above, but beneath a dark root near my paws rested another smell colder than the others. Boa constrictor. It lay so still that the ground around it seemed part of the darkness itself. No warning sound, no leaves moving, only the smell of cold scales and earth pressed for a long time beneath wet roots. It did not move, but my body remembered the silence. Not everything that hunted made sound before striking. After many failed lunges, I stopped chasing every movement. I began waiting until the distance between my body and the trembling leaves became short enough. Another agouti stopped beneath a low cluster of roots where rainwater still rested in shallow pockets. I lowered myself flat against the earth. My hind legs pressed deep into soft mud. This time, I didn't leap when it first moved. I waited one more beat. When the small body burst sideways across the roots, I lunged lower than before, shorter than before. My front paws slammed into the rotten leaves together with the sound of small bones striking beneath my claws. The prey convulsed violently beneath my paws. My jaws closed almost immediately, clumsy, crooked, but deep enough. The smell of hot blood flooded my mouth. My body shook hard through the first few breaths. My heart pounded so fast that my ears could hear nothing except blood moving inside my head. I held the small creature tightly beneath my jaws until it stopped trembling. After that, the forest became very quiet. I ate more slowly than Mother. Not clean, not smooth, but the emptiness inside my stomach no longer remained the same. The trembling in my hind legs slowly eased. My jaws still hurt, but this time, the pressure inside my mouth no longer felt useless. My body remembered the weight of the leap. The direction prey changed. The distance between trembling leaves and the moment the body had to strike. After that, hunting no longer felt like something I only watched Mother do. It began living inside my own body, together with the teeth growing larger in the darkness of the Blackwater forest. Floodwater climbed halfway up the bamboo trunks. Long hollow stalks crowded together beneath an evening light, slowly sinking into thick blue-gray mist. The smell of wet bamboo mixed with old mud and layers of leaves left too long beneath black water. I moved slowly through the flooded grove, my belly nearly touching the cold surface. Each step opened the soft mud around my claws before sealing shut again. At that time, the forest was full of sound. Insects vibrated endlessly inside the heavy, damp air. Water dripped in long intervals from the bamboo joints into the dark pools below. High above, capuchins snapped short. Quick calls between branches trembling softly in the canopy. Farther away, toucans echoed through thick leaves, their voices round and hollow like wood struck against wood. Wet leaves brushed bamboo skin. Something slid beneath the water near the drowned roots, everything layered together into a dense moving shell around my ears. I could not smell prey clearly yet. No fresh blood, no warm fur resting too long in one place. I crossed the flooded bamboo out of habits my body had learned through many wet seasons before. Paws low, shoulders lowered, ears turning constantly between the water below and the leaves above. Mother had already moved farther ahead, beyond several body lengths. Her scent still lingered thinly inside the mist. Then a space appeared. Not a new sound, no roar, no heavy branch breaking. Just a piece of the forest suddenly gone. The capuchins stopped first. One chain of calls cut off in the middle and never returned. Then the toucans vanished. No more heavy wings shifting through leaves, no more hollow voices dropping through the mist. Other sounds remained insects. Dripping water, leaves touching leaves, but the upper forest felt pulled farther away. My body stopped before I understood what had changed. My belly lowered deeper into the cold mud, neck stiff, tail still behind my hind legs, ears tilted upward toward the darkening canopy overhead. The air remained wet and heavy, but something was pressing the entire canopy into silence. I heard the faint movement of a three-toed sloth somewhere higher above, slow, almost soundless. A branch trembled once before going still again. Life still remained in the upper layers, but everything there held its breathing low. Then the air above tore open. A branch shook so violently that pooled water burst from the leaves in long streams. A dark shape cut through the thick mist between the bamboo trunks. No warning scream came first, only the sudden pressure of enormous wings forcing air downward into the forest below. Wet leaves compressed sharply. At the same instant, a young monkey released one short, thin cry. I lifted my eyes. One small body had been ripped away from the rhythm of the capuchin troop. Branches exploded outward around the dark mass, diving from the canopy. Large claws locked into brown fur, still jerking violently. Within only a few heartbeats, everything had vanished from where it had been. The mud had not killed it, not the black water, not the darkness close to the ground where I searched for tracks and blood. Death had fallen from above. The bamboo still trembled lightly after the strike, but the forest did not regain its voice immediately. The silence stayed longer than the movement of the wings. I remained pressed against the cold mud. No capuchins nearby anymore. No birds moving through the canopy. Only water dripping steadily from bamboo trunks and insects humming farther beyond this silent patch of forest. My body began remembering something I had never understood before. Bird calls could warn of movement. Monkey voices could warn that something was hunting. And when all of them vanished together, that emptiness weighed more than a roar. A sudden gust forced downward behind me. Bamboo leaves lashed across my face. Cold water dropped from above onto my neck and shoulders. My ears twitched sharply. My front claws buried deeper into the soft mud. It landed very close. I could not see the full shape through the dense bamboo, but I heard the weight of claws gripping a thick branch above the water. Mist trembled around folding wings. The smell of wet feathers and faint fresh blood drifted down from the canopy. I did not charge, did not roar, did not follow. I only stayed motionless beneath the low darkness of the flooded bamboo. Cold water pressed against my belly for a long time, but my body did not move. At that moment, the upper forest did not belong to me. Even something strong on the ground had to remain still when the canopy began moving overhead. Then, the dark mass disappeared again. Branches shook several more times before becoming still. Dripping water returned first. Much later, scattered bird calls rose again somewhere far away. But the capuchins still did not speak. I left the mud later than every other creature. My ears stayed turned toward the canopy longer than before. I did not understand the sky the way humans do. I did not know the name of the thing that had dropped through the mist above me. But from that day on, my body began reading the places where the forest suddenly became silent. And I understood that there were teeth above my head too. The smell of the ground began breaking apart as the water rose. Old hunting paths no longer connected together. Mud banks, where I once stepped inside my mother's tracks, now lay beneath cold, slow black water. Fallen trunks leaned sideways through the current, half submerged beneath the smell of softened rot. Tree roots rose from the flood like long, slick bodies, trembling gently with the movement of water. In some places, the water stood still so long that the mud beneath began breathing out the heavy, sour scent of dead leaves. Mother still moved the same way as before, but her body became faster. She no longer waited beside the water's edge for me to press close against her side. She chose where to enter the current almost immediately. Shoulders lowered, head level. Her whiskers twitched once above the surface before the large black and gold body slipped into the cold flooded forest without much sound. I still followed her scent. Wet fur, old skin caught against bark, boar scent lingering through moss half covered by rising water. But the distance between us began growing longer. Sometimes I could no longer hear her footsteps at all, only water touching tree trunks, thin high insects above the dark leaves, slow whirlpools dragging dead leaves against roots. The high water season changed the shape of the forest. Places that had once been ground became currents. Places where I could once run now had to be crossed by swimming. I began seeing Mother walk along fallen trunks more often than before. Sometimes she climbed onto higher bark to pass over deeper water, then vanished behind wet black leaves before I reached the same place. Each stretch of water was no longer something to follow through. It became a choice. Mother entered first at a wide flooded channel where the current pulled harder. I watched her head cut the surface into a long dark line toward the far bank. When she arrived, she climbed onto exposed roots and stood still beneath the trees. I remained behind. Cold water pressed against my chest. The current dragged the fur beneath my belly sideways. I released one short call. The water swallowed it. Mother did not return immediately. She remained inside the root shadow, nearly blending into the dark trunk behind her. Only her ears moved slightly with the sound of the current. The space between us widened after that silence. I lowered one paw into the mud at the edge. Soft, cold. No shape beneath it. I stretched one foreleg into the water, trying to keep my head above the current the way Mother always did. A fallen trunk leaned nearby. I moved toward it. Then the pain burst upward, fast and sharp. It shot from my paw all the way through my hind leg, like a heated thorn driven deep into flesh. My leg jerked back on instinct. My body lost rhythm immediately. My chest tilted downward. My nose struck the cold black water. Breath broke apart into one rough sound inside my throat. The mud below remained still. I did not understand what had touched me. I only understood that things existed beneath soft mud that water scent could not warn about. Some places in the forest could bite back. My hind leg began burning with each pulse of blood. The current pulled me sideways away from Mother. I kicked harder, but the injured leg could no longer keep steady rhythm. Wet fur dragged heavily against my body. Water flooded into my nose again. Bitter mud filled my throat. I heard my claws scrape across the bark of the fallen trunk. Slip away, catch again. The wood was slick with moss and long floodwater. My forelegs held the edge for one short moment before sliding loose again. My injured hind leg twisted outward in the current. My chest crushed against the cold trunk hard enough that my breathing shook in short bursts. I called again. Only the water answered. Mother still stood on the far bank. She did not plunge back into the current the way she had during seasons when I was too small to keep my head above water. Her large body remained still among the dark roots, waiting. I drove my claws deeper into the softened bark peeling beneath the flood. Shoulders pulled upward, chest dragged across the trunk edge. My injured hind leg slammed against the wood, sending another sharp burst of heat up toward my hip. At last, my body managed to climb onto the floating trunk. I lay there for a long time, breathing broken and short, water dripping from my whiskers into the current below. My hind leg curled tightly beneath my belly, trembling lightly with the dull, pulsing pain deep inside the flesh. Only then did Mother step closer. She lowered her head and briefly smelled the injured leg. Her breath felt hot and short against my wet fur. Then she turned away and continued forward through the flooded trees and dark spaces, carrying the strange scent of flood season. I stood more slowly than before. My body remembered before my mind understood. Choose where to enter the water yourself. Read the mud before placing your paw. Keep your head above the current, even when pain runs through the flesh. Later, I still remembered the sounds of that day clearly. Water covering my calls. The smell of mud where pain burst upward beneath my paw. The cold, slick bark beneath my claws, and the distance between my mother's body and mine during that season of rising water. After that day, I began noticing scents in the forest that did not belong to us. In the northern flooded region, on trunks standing high above the water, there were claw marks deeper than Mother's, higher, heavier with scent too. The ground changed before I understood we had entered somewhere else. The mud no longer felt soft and cold like the black water lowlands in the south. My paws stopped sinking so deeply. Beneath the drier layer of dead leaves, the earth was harder, still holding warmth from the daytime sun. Large stones rested between raised roots, faintly warm beneath my pads. Dry roots scraped against the softer flesh between my toes whenever I crossed them. The air was different too. Less water, less rotting algae. The dry leaves held onto things the river usually carried away. Mother moved more slowly as we entered the northern edge of the forest. I stayed close behind her shoulder, where the familiar scent of damp fur still filled my nose. But beneath her smell, something else had begun to remain in the air. Heavy, sharp, old. It did not smell like capybara, not like peccary, not like monkeys or dead fish trapped beneath flooded roots. It stayed on bark and dry leaves longer than any other scent. I had not seen anything yet, but my throat had already begun to dry each time I breathed. Mother stopped beside a massive tree whose roots rose from the ground like black bones. Across the bark, long claw marks stretched high above me. Fresh strips of bark still carried the dense, sharp scent beneath the surface. A few dull yellow hairs clung inside the cracks. Beneath the roots lingered the smell of old dried blood mixed with urine and warm soil. I lowered my nose closer. That scent did not belong to Mother. My shoulders dropped lower without understanding why. My steps shortened. I paused for long moments beside each scarred trunk. The space around those trees did not feel like the southern forest anymore. The air here felt thicker. Even the insects seemed to keep their distance from the trees, carrying that heavy scent. Mother read those signs faster than I could. Her whiskers trembled lightly in the hot wind. She stood motionless for a long time before the largest tree, where old urine still clung inside the dry bark. But she did not rub her cheek against it, did not raise her tail to mark it, did not rest beneath the roots the way she did in the flooded forest. She turned away, left that direction behind. No hunting, no chasing the monkeys moving high above the canopy, no entering the deepest marked trees. We circled along the edge of the drier forest, where the leaves were thicker and the scents were weaker. I did not understand territory, but I was beginning to understand that not every place carrying animal tracks could be entered. There were parts of the forest where the body lowered itself before the eyes ever saw anything. As Mother changed direction, a small movement appeared among the dry roots ahead. A smaller cat stepped from the low shadows. Its spotted fur looked finer and denser than mine. Its body stayed close to the ground. It paused briefly near the trees marked with claws. Nose pointed toward the large trunk. Then it disappeared quickly back into the low vegetation without moving any deeper. Its scent was thinner and lighter than a jaguar's, but even it avoided this place. Above the drier canopy, several dark shapes circled slowly in the late heat. They turned above a patch of old blood scent clinging heavily near the stone roots. I smelled dead flesh, long dissolved beneath the hardened leaves. This forest had known hunting. It had known collisions. Something had once fallen here and never risen again. As darkness began to gather between the larger trunks, the scent on the bark was no longer the only signal. A low sound began to move through the ground. It came from far away, very far, deep and heavy like black water striking hollow wood during flood season. But this sound did not drift with the river. It traveled through the trees, through the dry mud beneath my chest. A roar. I never saw the thing that made it, but my breathing stopped before my mind understood. My belly pressed against the ground, ears flattened. My tail became nearly still beneath the dry leaves. The earth trembled faintly beneath my chest each time the sound rolled through the northern forest. Mother froze too. She did not answer it, did not mark the trees, did not move toward the roar. She only pressed her shoulder softly against mine and guided me away from the sound with slow lowered steps. The sharp scent on the trees slowly faded behind us. But that night, I still remembered the high claw marks across the dry bark, the urine scent that did not belong to Mother, the strands of fur trapped in the trunk, and the low sound that had traveled through the earth before it reached my ears. No fight happened, no rival ever appeared. But after that night, the forest no longer felt like an endless darkness stretching in every direction. It had begun to form invisible borders. Borders that could only be seen through the nose, through the throat drying with each breath, through the silence held inside the body while low roars moved between the old trees. And though I did not know it then, I still had somewhere to return to, the scent of Mother. But by the end of the rainy season, the river itself would carry that scent out of my world. Near the end of the second rainy season, the Blackwater River grew colder after many nights of relentless rain. The channels near the fallen Chiba carried the smell of rotting leaves, soft mud, and broken branches drifting down from the deeper flooded forest. Fast water struck the submerged roots and sent steady, heavy vibrations through the soil along the banks. Mother no longer moved the way she once had. I began hearing it before I fully saw it. Each time she stepped toward the water, her front paws entered the mud more slowly. The weight of her body pressed harder into the earth than before. Beneath her wet fur, the thin scent of old blood from the capybara hunt near deep water still lingered. But the rain weakened it quickly. The black water pulled the scent away in small layers each night. She rested longer beneath the lower trees. Before entering the water, her nose remained close to the mud for long stretches, reading signals I still could not fully understand. I continued following her along the old hunting paths, but the distance between us had begun to change. Sometimes the river cut her scent apart between the flooded roots, and when that happened, my body no longer followed only the old trails. I began noticing smaller movements in the forest. A low sleeping bird trembling against branches during the night rain. I lunged too early the first time. The branch snapped hard beneath my weight, and the bird vanished into darkness before my claws reached it. On later nights, I learned to keep my weight lower against the soft ground, learned to stop breathing briefly before the final leap. Iguanas rested motionless along damp trunks near the river. Their bodies carried so much of the forest temperature that they nearly disappeared from the world unless the cold skin scent beneath the rain gave them away. I began sensing the smaller differences between mud, rotting leaves, and living bodies trying to remain perfectly still. Beneath the flooded leaves, small rodents created short rustling sounds before vanishing again. Oil along their fur left faint scent lines between the roots. They were not enough to keep my stomach full for long, but enough to keep my body standing during the days Mother hunted less often. After every distant hunt, I still returned to search for her scent. It remained on low mud banks, on trunks where her fur had brushed, on wet stones beside the river. But it no longer stayed fixed the way it once had. After each heavy rain, the familiar scent trails became thinner. Amazon never explained the change. The rain simply continued falling. Mud continued swallowing tracks, Leaves continued covering the old paths. Water continued dragging every scent toward the dark lower river. Then one night, the rain became heavier than before. The current around the fallen ceiba turned violent and dark. The submerged roots barely remained visible beneath the rushing water, black and curved like claws trapped beneath the flood. I followed behind as Mother moved toward the riverbank. That was the last time I held her scent clearly. There was no great collision, no long roar, no clear image left inside me except the river moving too violently beneath the rain. Then the smell of blood appeared, thin, faint, pulled apart into broken streaks across the dark water. Farther along the main current, giant otters released short warning calls before slowly moving away from the area. Their voices echoed low beneath the rain like distant signals dragged away by water. Under the cold current, scattered vibrations spread through the mud along the shore. I smelled piranha in the water where the blood had thinned. Near dawn, several black vultures began circling high above the rainy mist. But there was no body. Nothing surfaced between the ceiba roots. Nothing remained to drag back onto land. I returned to the riverbank many times that night. My nose stayed close to the mud where her old tracks had once pressed into the shore. I walked along the river beneath the rain, scraping lightly against wet roots before returning again to the place where the blood scent had grown faintest. The river no longer held enough scent to guide me. I roared into the rain. The sound struck the water and dissolved into the flooded forest. It was not yet deep or long like the call of a full-grown male, but it was enough to silence the insects along the bank for a brief moment. No answer came back. Only the sound of water moving through roots, rain striking broad leaves, the distant calls of otters drifting farther downriver. Then the insects returned again, as though the forest itself had never changed. In the days that followed, I kept returning to that stretch of river. Each time I came back, the blood scent was weaker. The mud held fewer traces. The current shifted differently around the ceiba roots. The old scent paths dissolved quickly beneath the final rains of the season. Until one day, I could no longer find Mother's scent at all. My body still remembered the place. The pressure of fast water beneath my paws, the smell of cold mud around the fallen roots. But the forest no longer kept enough signs for me to continue following them. From then on, the Blackwater became something else. Not only a hunting ground, not only a path through the flooded forest, not only the place that once carried familiar warmth during the first rainy season of my life. It became the place that held scent and carried scent away. Without Mother's smell to return to, I could no longer keep walking behind another body. I began sleeping farther away, beneath the lower trees, began forming my own hunting paths through the flooded forest, began leaving my own scent on mud, roots, and damp trunks beside the Black River. Childhood ended somewhere inside the long silence between the sound of moving water. And when the third dry season arrived, the forest no longer moved around me through Mother's trail. Every path from then on had to be chosen by my own body. At the beginning of the third dry season, the water began pulling away from the old paths inside the flooded forest. Mud banks that had once rested deep beneath black water now split into hard, dark slabs that turned cold after nightfall. Massive roots rose higher from the ground. Stones held heat long after the sun disappeared. The drier air allowed the scent of passing animals to cling longer between the trunks. And for the first time, there were no footsteps ahead of me anymore. No trace of my mother's body left along the trails to tell me which direction was safe. No familiar sound of a larger shape pushing water ahead through the dark channels. My ears had to hold every direction at once now. My nose had to keep track of shifting wind moving through separate parts of the forest. I began choosing my own routes. Which mud banks stayed soft enough to hold capybara tracks? Which roots rose high enough to sleep above sudden night water? Which edges of water still carried the smell of dead fish and peccary passing after dark? Which stretches of dry bamboo snapped too sharply when touched by moving flesh? The forest no longer wrapped around me as one endless thing the way it had when I followed behind my mother. It began separating. Some places held water longer. Some held the smell of death beneath wet leaves for many days. Some opened too wide for an ambush. Some needed only one wrong step to send night birds bursting from the branches. I started walking the same paths again and again, from mud banks marked by small hoof prints to tree trunks rubbed smooth by old capybara scent, from dark water edges where fish breathed close to the river surface toward dry roots tall enough to rest beneath before daylight returned. At first, my body made more mistakes than successful hunts. Some nights I moved against the wind. An agouti exploded into the brush before I even saw it. Once, my claw touched dry stone and made a sound small but sharp as a breaking branch. Birds, sleeping low inside the roots, lifted instantly into the air. After that, the forest changed direction around sound. I once rested too close to the smell of an old carcass. Only when large wings began circling low above the canopy did I leave. During the dry season, warm stones drew smaller creatures searching for the last heat left behind by daylight. I found a tegu near a dry root wall where stone still carried warmth. Its body was low and long. Its tongue flicked constantly through the air before vanishing back into its mouth. I lowered my head. My shoulders pressed against the heated ground. Close enough. I lunged. One forepaw slid slightly across dust-covered stone. That single lost moment of balance was enough. The tegu whipped its body sideways and vanished beneath the roots. I remained there inside the heat, trapped under the rock surface, breathing short, my ears still following the faint scratching, fading deeper beneath dry earth. Far above, a turkey vulture drifted slowly over a lower stretch of forest where the wind carried the smell of opened flesh. I lifted my head. I did not continue that direction. The smell of carcasses did not only carry food, it carried flies, rot, other bodies searching for the same place. The forest began teaching itself to me through things that did not directly hunt me, through the flight paths of scavenger birds, through places where insects gathered more densely, through winds that no longer smelled clean with water. But the largest lesson of that dry season did not come from small creatures. It came from a herd of collared peccary inside a narrow passage between dry bamboo and heat-soaked stone. I found them first by scent, thick, hot, dense with fur and dried mud. The smell of many bodies moving tightly together through enclosed ground. I lowered my head and moved slowly across roots, rising from the earth. But the passage was too narrow. Dry bamboo closed both sides. Heated stone pressed beneath my paws. There was no open space wide enough to move behind the herd. No deep mud soft enough to hide the sound of claws. I still moved closer. The smell of flesh was too strong. Then one peccary turned its head. A short hiss burst from its throat. The bodies ahead tightened together immediately, instead of scattering apart like capybara or young deer. Small hooves hammered against dry ground in rapid bursts. Hot fur scent flooded the narrow space. The movement ahead began pressing back toward me. I no longer had room for an ambush. Dry bamboo and heated stone on both sides. A wall of peccaries surging together ahead, behind me. Only low mud descending into deeper water. I turned before the distance vanished completely. My hind legs slipped hard against heated rock. Cold mud covered my belly as I threw myself into the water's edge. Deep water swallowed the hissing behind me until it became dull vibrations fading beneath the river surface. I swam for a long time before climbing onto a low bank of roots. No prey, only cold mud clinging beneath my body and the smell of peccary still filling my nose. But my body carried more from that night than hunger. Large prey did not only have flesh, it had movement, numbers, pressure that pushed back against the hunter. After that night, my patrol routes became clearer inside me. Which mud banks were used to read tracks? Which trunks carried strong enough scent to mark a return path? Which water edges capybara crossed after dark? And which bamboo passages had to be avoided if the smell of peccary became too dense ahead? The forest no longer moved around me. It began settling inside my body instead, like a map made from scent, mud, water, and places where mistakes were no longer allowed. In the middle of the dry season, water shrank away from many low sections of forest. Mud paths that had once stayed soft and cold beneath the rains cracked apart into hard plates edged sharp as stone. The air no longer carried heavy water. It felt lighter now, hotter. Sound lingered longer between dry trunks. Every step across shallow mud released a faint breaking noise. The last remaining pools gathered many smells into narrow places. Old capybara scent clinging to flattened grass. Animal fur trapped beneath roots. Small carcasses drying beneath the sun near the mud edge. And old water lying still beneath dark algae. I moved toward a familiar hunting pool while the sun remained low behind the trees. The waterline had already retreated farther than the previous season. Roots rose from the mud like black bones driven into cracked earth. A scavenger bird walked slowly across the far bank with its beak lowered close to the ground. Farther away, old tapir tracks had dried into shallow bowls of fine dust. I lowered my head beside the pool. The water no longer smelled clean the way it had after the rains. It felt heavier now, denser. Beneath the heated mud rested the fresh urine scent of another jaguar. It still clung wet against a trunk beside the water. Not my mother's, not distant and faded like the old drifting marks near the edges of abandoned territory. Close, fresh, still holding warmth beneath the sun. My nose pressed near the scratched bark. A few dark yellow hairs remained caught inside the cracks. Tracks near the water had not fully dried yet. My shoulders lowered farther. My tail stayed tight behind me. Air moved into my throat slowly and hot. I parted my mouth slightly to hold the scent longer. Fresh claw marks dragged down the trunk beside the pool, leaving body scent the sun had not erased yet. I remained still for longer than one breath. Then, across the pool, between roots rising from cracked mud, another body stepped out. Not fully grown. Its shoulders were not yet thick like the older males whose scent once settled deeply through the black water territory. But it was heavy enough to crack dry mud beneath its paws. Its head stayed low, ears flattened sideways. Its eyes did not hold mine for long. It smelled the air the same way I did. We did not attack immediately. The dry season water between us was too narrow to ignore each other easily, but too important for either of us to leave first. We circled slowly around the shrinking pool, keeping enough distance to twist away if the other body lunged. My claws pressed deeper into cracked mud. Shoulder muscles tightened beneath heated skin. My breath moved slower and heavier than before. The fresh urine scent around the trunks dried my throat. It shifted left. I adjusted with it. No deep roaring. Only the sound of paws changing position across hardened mud and the faint movement of water at the shrinking edge. Near the waterline, a young black caiman rested motionless like half-submerged black wood beneath the mud. Only its eyes and snout remained above the dark surface. It did not leave, but neither I nor the other male moved too close to the water's edge, where that shadow waited still. A few steps farther away, a karakara pulling apart a small carcass from dry grass suddenly lifted its head. When we moved nearer, it beat its wings and rose from the mud. The sound of those wings sliced sharply through the dry air. Both our bodies stopped for exactly one breath, then continued circling. The pool was no longer a place for drinking. It became a narrow tension, holding blood that had not yet appeared, holding claws buried beneath mud, holding the bodies of other creatures waiting near the edge. The final distance disappeared when he crossed too close in front of me. Everything happened faster than the bird lifting from the mud bank. Both bodies collided near the shallow water, shoulder against shoulder. One foreleg swept across my face and claws scraped through the fur near my neck. I heard the low growl vibrating inside his chest before his teeth reached my face. A hot, sharp force tore across the bridge of my nose. Skin opened. Blood spilled instantly through my whiskers. The smell of my own blood burst into the dry air, hotter than the pool water, heavier than mud. For the first time, this hunting ground carried the blood scent of my own body among urine, dry roots, and the small dead things along the shore. I bit into his shoulder, my teeth closed around thick muscle beneath skin. He jerked violently backward. Mud scattered beneath both our hind legs. We separated almost at the same moment. Neither of us lunged again. Even a small wound during the dry season could slow hunting for many days. Blood brought flies. Torn flesh could trap rot beneath lingering heat. One badly placed bite could weaken a leg needed to cross deep mud or strike a full-grown capybara. The other male retreated first. He never fully turned his back. He stepped backwards slowly through the dry roots before disappearing into darker forest beyond the pool. I did not follow. Blood continued dripping onto cracked mud beneath my paws. Every breath sent sharp pain through the torn bridge of my nose as water scent and blood passed over exposed flesh. The young caiman still floated beside the water, unmoving as if nothing had happened. Far above, the Karakara lowered its circling path once more toward the mud bank, now carrying fresh blood scent. I remained beside the pool longer than usual. My scent now rested here, beside the scent of another rival. No longer only a place to pass through, no longer only hunting paths and drinking water during the dry season. This place had begun turning into something that needed to be held with muscle, blood, and skin that would never grow back the same again. Many seasons later, the scar across my nose still tightened slightly whenever the air turned hot. And each time I smelled dry mud around shrinking pools, I remembered the sound of Karakara wings cutting through the air before my own blood first touched the hunting ground. At the end of the hardest dry season, the water pulled far back from the flooded grasslands along the river. The shallow pools that once connected everything were now only narrow dark ribbons between thick mud and sunburned grass. During the day, the mud held heat until warm vapor drifted around my legs. But after the sun sank behind the low forest far away, the ground cooled quickly again, trapping dampness beneath the cracked surface above. The capybara herd returned to the same water path every evening. Their tracks pressed into one another, carving deep grooves from the grazing fields down to the riverbank. The grass around the trail had been bitten close to the roots. Old dung, wet fur, and churned mud hung thick in the low air near the ground. There were not many places left to drink or sink into water anymore. Other pools had dried out or exposed mud too hot to stand in. Everything returned here. I began waiting near that water trail many days earlier. Not every day did I stay close to the mud edge. Sometimes I only lay beneath roots that rose above the waterline, listening to them feed in the low evening light. I learned the movement of the herd through smell and sound long before I saw them. The adults always stayed near the outer edges. Their ears shifted constantly toward movement in the grass. The young ones slowed whenever the herd angled down toward the water. One small juvenile, lighter around the neck, often drifted toward the softer mud where legs sank deeper. I remembered how the wind changed near dusk, remembered when the insects thickened beneath the heat-soaked grass, remembered the moment when the ground cooled just enough for my paws to stop scraping dry sounds across the hardened mud. I did not chase far. My body stayed low among the shallow grass. Warm mud pressed beneath my stomach. Breath moved slowly through nostrils, filled with the smell of capybara fur baked all day beneath the sun. Ahead of me, the dark water remained still beneath dying evening light, between distant trees. But that water path did not belong only to the capybara herd. Some evenings, the surface stayed quiet for too long. A small bubble rose through the dark water and burst out of rhythm with the normal movement of the current. Waterbirds suddenly changed direction while the herd was still feeding. Sometimes a cold, sharp scent crawled up from the mud edge, different from fish or dead things trapped beside shrinking water. Once, I saw the surface swell very slightly before becoming still again, as though something beneath it had shifted position. I did not understand what waited below, but my body remembered that water which stayed quiet too long was not always empty. That evening, the herd came down later than usual. The air felt colder than the days before. Wind dragged the smell of mud and rotting grass along the river edge. I stayed low enough for my whiskers to brush damp earth. The leading adult stepped into the water first, its body lowered close to the surface. The others followed behind in a slow, crowded line. The pale-necked juvenile drifted toward the softer mud on the left. One leg sank deep into the thick ground and hesitated there for a short moment. My hind legs tightened beneath me. At the same instant, the water in front of the herd swelled upward, very slightly, but enough to send water birds exploding from the riverside grass too early. I lunged out just as the river burst open from below. Mud, water, fur, and scales twisted together inside one cold, clouded moment. I locked my jaws around the young one's shoulder while its body jerked between two pulling directions. A heavy force from beneath the water yanked hard at the rear of the prey. My jaws pressed deeper through wet fur packed with mud. Then the thing beneath the water struck upward, not at my throat, but my hind leg was clipped hard by rigid jaws and scales sliding beneath cold water. Sharp pain tore through my thigh as my body was dragged sideways toward the river edge. Water flooded my nose. Mud splashed across my eyes. My forelegs clawed violently into soft earth, sliding backward toward the dark current. I did not keep that hunt clean. I only held long enough to drag the prey away from the water before the force beneath finally released. Then the river closed behind me again. No more crashing sounds. Only small waves slapping against mud and harsh breath forcing itself from my chest while I pulled my body and the carcass toward higher ground. The capybara herd vanished into distant grass and dark water. Waterbirds returned after many silent breaths. I dragged the young one through thick mud, cooling beneath the growing dark. My hind leg hurt each time I placed weight on it. My steps leaned sideways. Claws dug deeper into the mud to steady myself. The muscles in my thigh twitched beneath wet fur while I kept dragging the carcass farther from the river edge. I ate that night, but the memory that stayed behind was not the smell of hot blood or soft flesh beneath my jaws. I remembered the sound beneath the capybara herd before the water opened. Remembered bubbles rising wrong through still water. Remembered the cold, sharp scent crawling along the mud edge. Remembered hard scales brushing against my hind leg beneath cloudy water. After that hunt, I understood something near water. Prey rarely belongs to only one hunter. The places with the most food also keep the most teeth. And every time a body drags food onto land, part of it is always left behind. In the days after, I lay still longer while my hind leg slowly recovered beneath thick fur. Then the rains began returning with the sweet smell of tree resin drifting through damp air. Black water rose slowly through the old lowlands, covering tracks, drag marks, and dried blood pressed into the mud. The forest began erasing what had happened beside that riverbank. The rain returned with a heavy layer of dampness spreading across the low black waters of the forest. Wet leaves sagged closer to the ground than before. Roots that had cracked dry during the hot season sank once again beneath soft, dark mud, almost black in color. Every step I took pressed deeper now, leaving tracks that lingered longer beneath rainwater flowing slowly through the earth. The air changed before the sounds did. I smelled tree resin. Many large trunks had been carved open by insects, tunneling deep into the bark. Thick pale yellow sap leaked from old wounds, sliding slowly down the wood before hardening into a heavy sweet scent trapped inside the damp air. It did not smell like ripe fruit. It was thicker than that. It carried the smell of rotting wood, fungus, and old rainwater held too long beneath fallen leaves. I moved slower after the low water season. My left hind leg still twitched whenever it sank too deeply into soft mud. The place where the cayman had dragged against muscle no longer burned with sharp pain. But each time I pressed weight into low ground, the muscle tightened deep inside before slowly releasing again. I did not hunt much during the first rains. Most of the time, I lay beneath falling water between large trunks while the rain softened old blood dried stiff around my fur. The forest no longer breathed with the rhythm of pursuit. It slowed, softer, wetter. Small creatures began filling my ears again. Beneath the roots of large trees, leafcutter ants moved in long black lines. They sliced pieces from green leaves and carried them across soft ground in endless steady movement. From far away, the ant trails looked like cracks crawling through the forest. I stood still watching them pass through low mud, and inside that wet earth smell, my body remembered another old scent ants once covering cold fur during the dry season before. But these ants did not eat flesh. They carried leaves, carried water, carried green fragments disappearing into the ground. After short afternoon rain, small calls began echoing between wet stones and low trunks. Poisoned dart frogs hidden beneath rotting leaves released short, even sounds that never changed rhythm. Their calls did not lower my shoulders the way hoofed animals did. They simply stayed inside the air like water dripping endlessly from a dark crack in stone. Higher above, spider monkeys moved through thin branches with long arms and tails wrapped tightly around limbs. They shook leaves in small waves before vanishing from openings between the canopy layers. No warning cries, no smell of fear, only movements light enough to shift the sound of the whole forest for a few breaths. Then a blue morpho butterfly crossed the damp light in front of me. It appeared like a piece of colored water. Its blue wings caught gray light from the flooded ground before vanishing into darkness beneath low palms. I watched it longer than usual before continuing forward. Nothing inside those movements pulled me toward a hunt. The forest had returned to its low rhythm, a slow rhythm that nearly carried sleep inside it, until I smelled the old scent beneath wet earth. I stopped near the low ground where water had once pulled away from the den that year. No carcass remained. No cold young fur hardened in mud. No old shape between the roots. Rain had changed the color of the earth. New leaves covered the old mud heavily. Insects and water had carried everything away from the surface long ago. But beneath softened leaves swollen with dampness, the smell of ants still remained faintly. I lowered my nose closer. Rain striking stone and roots sounded like that very old cold night. My body stayed still longer than normal. I breathed deeper into the soft ground before my pause and avoided stepping directly across one dark patch of mud beside a fallen trunk. My ears stayed low for several breaths, not to listen for prey, not to prepare for a charge, only because my body had once stood this way in this place before. Amazon always covers things again. Water thins the scent away. Insects pull carcasses beneath the soil, new leaves bury old mud. But the body still remembers through small reflexes left behind inside muscle and breath. In places where nothing remains to be seen, recognition rises from cold earth and the sound of rain held too long inside the ears. I stood there for a very long time. No calls came. Nothing moved from the dark. Only cold ground beneath my paws, the heavy sweet smell of resin inside damp air, and the sound of ants moving beneath dead leaves near the roots. The forest had sealed that place shut, but the rhythm inside my chest still changed whenever I passed it. When I finally left the low ground, I did not mark any trunks. I did not claw bark. I did not leave new scent behind. I only walked slowly through soft mud while rain gradually blurred my tracks behind me. After that, territory no longer meant only water or the places where prey crossed during dry months. It held the smell of old blood inside fur, held the ground where bodies once lay still through long cold nights, held the paths of bodies already vanished beneath black water, and far beyond the edge of my territory, beneath the smell of rain and tree resin, another scent began drifting through the night wind: smoke, oil, hot metal, the smell of creatures that did not belong to the forest. During the heart of the wet season, the river rose slowly through the black roots and soft mud along the banks. But the forest changed before my eyes ever found the opening. My nose touched it first. A dry, heated smell slipped through the heavy Amazon vapor. Not like trees split open after storms. Not like earth baked too long beneath the sun. This smell carried something sharp and hard inside it. Smoke. Beneath the smoke lay oil, cold metal, burned wood, old sweat, and another strange scent floating over the water, like a thin skin that would not sink into the mud. I moved more slowly as the trees began thinning apart. The ground beneath my paws no longer held thick layers of rotting leaves, fewer insects, no endless blanket of sound sealing the darkness the way the deep forest always did. The silences here opened too wide between noises. When something hard struck against something else near the riverbank, the sound traveled far, straight, sharp. The roots and wet air did not soften it the way they softened snapping branches or the tail of a caiman slapping through mud. I stopped beneath a low trunk that had been cut long ago. Dead wood still held smoke inside its black cracks. No monkeys called warnings overhead, no waves of insects rising and falling like the breathing of the night forest. Here, the darkness had been opened. The light did not come from the moon hidden behind clouds. It trembled low near the ground, yellow and hot, casting hard shadows from broken trunks across the mud. Long shapes floated beside the riverbank. They carried the smell of oil and old wood. Whenever water touched them, they knocked softly against the shore with short, dry sounds. Near the glowing place, an animal stood apart from the trees. Its body was larger than a capybara, shoulders higher than a peccary. Its smell was hot and thick, but not like tapir or the small deer that moved through flooded forest. No old mud beneath the belly, no familiar scent of black water and rotting leaves clinging to wild skin. It stood exposed inside the open forest with its head lowered, slow to answer the wind. When I shifted one paw across the bare ground, it only tilted its ears slightly before becoming still again. A capybara would have fled from farther away than this. A herd of peccaries would already have turned with the wind before I even saw them. But this animal kept its breathing slow and even. The heat of blood inside its body was so clear that I could almost follow its movement beneath the thick hide. That easy rhythm made the air around it feel wrong. I pressed my belly lower into the earth. Old rain still clung to my whiskers. The wind carried smoke and livestock scent in drifting layers. Beneath them flickered the small fire near the riverbank. The sounds of hard objects striking together, the slap of water against floating wood. I did not understand those things. No claw marks cut into trees like the borders of another jaguar. No urine trails. No warning calls belonging to the forest. Then another smell lifted above all the others. It came faster than the livestock. A low creature near the ground sprang upright beside the edge of light. It had not seen me yet, but its nose pointed directly toward the shadows where I lay. Its body tightened before the sound burst free. The first bark split across the riverbank like a dry branch snapping beside my ear. Short, sharp, repeating fast. No rise and fall like night insects. Not like warning birds that suddenly fall silent. It kept striking the air in hard, endless bursts. Another answered from closer to the water. Then another from across the opening. The sounds began losing direction. I could no longer read distance through my ears the way I could inside deep forest. Barking exploded from one side. Hard objects clashed somewhere else. A thicker wave of smoke crawled low across the ground. The fire lifted higher, then turned. Tree shadows bent and broke across the open mud. My eyes narrowed as the moving light swept between the trunks. The animal standing in the clearing finally startled backward, but now the barking had already grown closer than its breathing. A larger creature stepped near the water. Sweat, oil, smoke. The smells thickened around the edge of light. Something burning shook gently inside its hand with every step. Fire swept across mud, tree trunks, the edge of my whiskers, then vanished again. The dogs ran fast over wet ground. Their paws struck bare earth uncovered by leaves. I backed away from the young livestock. No leap toward the throat. No shoulder slam like hunting peccary. No growl to hold ground. Only thicker smoke filling my nose. Sharp barking so close my ears flattened against my head. Hot light cutting across my eyes. Open ground too wide to hide darkness around my body. I turned. My front paws slid through thin mud before catching wet roots. Breath shortened hard inside my throat as I drove into thicker forest. Behind me, the barking continued in broken bursts along the riverbank. The fire still moved between scattered trunks, but deeper inside the forest, darkness thickened once more around my eyes and whiskers. Wet earth and rotting leaves slowly covered the smoke, still clinging inside my nose. I did not kill the animal standing in the open clearing. No blood coated my teeth. No fresh wounds marked my shoulders or neck. But while rain continued falling through the canopy, my body carried away a new connection. Human scent traveled beside easier food, but it also traveled beside dogs, beside fire that did not move like the moon, beside hard sounds that carried far across water, beside open ground too exposed to hide a body, beside borders that could not be read through jaguar scent. Many wet seasons later, whenever wind carried the smell of oil drifting over black water, my whiskers still remembered the sharp sting inside my nose from that night. I remembered the barking cutting the riverbank into short, sharp pieces, the fire trembling over empty mud, the animals standing too exposed inside the open forest where the jungle no longer breathed like the deep dark behind my back. Later, when I grew large enough to hold territory around the black water channels and the dry season came in banks, my land no longer carried only the smells of rivals, prey, and shifting water trails. Something else always remained at the forest edge. It left no claw marks on trees, no clear tracks beneath rain-soaked mud. It left smoke. My body had thickened like the great trunks growing beside black water, wider shoulders, heavier neck. Long swims across the slow river no longer burned my lungs the way they once had. When I crossed muddy banks, the soft ground sank deeper beneath my weight. Capybaras began fleeing earlier now, sometimes from nothing more than my scent lingering in wet wind. The black water system stretching through flooded forest became the line that carried my life. No place remained only somewhere I passed through anymore. Those waterways held my scent on clawed trees, crushed mud, urine dried and soaked again beneath rain. Many large trunks along the river still carried old claw marks beneath newer ones. Some bark still trapped strands of fur inside torn wood. Thick urine scent stayed low around the roots whenever the air grew heavy before rain. Paths through reeds and exposed roots had been pressed into familiar trails beneath my paws. Once my body became large enough to hold these waterways, they no longer remained places where I learned to survive. They became places I had to return to. I followed the same patrol circles again and again between black water and low forest. Mud banks where capybaras came to drink, tall trees beside old mating grounds, rotting wood still carrying distant traces of human scent, places where caiman eyes floated above slow water. After every heavy rain, everything changed smell quickly. Rainwater weakened old marks on trees. Fresh mud buried tracks. My scent was dragged away through black currents. I had to return. My claws carved deeper into wet bark. Fresh urine covered older layers not yet fully gone. My cheeks rubbed hard against trunks, leaving scent oil across damp moss. I crossed soft mud so fresh tracks would press over the older ones already fading. Territory did not remain around my body by itself. It needed my shoulders, my legs, my scent returning again and again. Some nights I traveled very far along the waterways, only to smell old trees once more. By the time the sky neared morning, my shoulders hung heavy from long patrol routes and mud pulling slow against my paws. The river no longer carried only my mother's scent. It became the place everything returned to in order to survive, where prey came to drink during heat, where caiman rested beneath dark reflections, where rain washed scent away the fastest, where I had to leave my body behind again and again. As my patrol routes stabilized, larger prey also began falling within my reach. A young tapir stood separated from its herd near cloudy water after rain. I moved low with the wind around exposed roots. No step on dry stone, no touch against broken branches. Wet mud covered most of my breath as I moved closer. The tapir was heavier and stronger than many animals I had hunted when younger. I did not leap directly for the throat the way I would with smaller prey. My body drove its shoulders sideways towards sinking mud near the water. The weight of both bodies collapsed the soft ground beneath us. Hot, heavy breath burst beside my ear before its body finally rolled sideways against the bank. With Cayman, I no longer looked at every still pool the same way. I read the quietness of mud near the water's edge, thin ripples around floating eyes, the direction of a tail creating faint pressure beneath black water, distance close enough to bite and pull away before the body twist came. Old lessons still lived inside my muscles whenever I stepped close to silent water. Then another scent began changing the rhythm of my patrols. The scent of an adult female appeared near clawed trees beside slow current. Not like prey, not like another male. It lingered longer on damp bark and pulled me back toward the same trunk across many nights. I did not move directly the way I hunted. I smelled the bark where her scent remained. My cheeks rubbed lower trunks. Fresh urine covered older roots. Some nights, I stood for long stretches inside hot mist, only listening to low sounds traveling through flooded forest. The first time our bodies touched happened beside black water, where many scent trails crossed. No long stillness came afterward. Patrol routes grew longer. Sleep became shorter. Rain erased scent faster. And more often, I found the signs of other males near the main waterways. One heavy night after rain, I stopped beside a large tree that had carried my scent through many flood seasons. Another smell rested there, fresh, sharp, not yet pulled far by water. New claw marks cut across older bark where my own claws had once carved deeper. I lowered my chest against the trunk. My lips pulled back so the scent would stay longer inside my nose. Breath moved heavy and hot through my throat. My shoulders already ached from long patrols. Still, my body shoved harder against the tree. Claws drove deeper into old bark. Wet wood burst loose beneath my paws. Fresh urine covered the stranger's scent before it fully faded. Then I moved deeper into the darkness beyond the main water road. I was still living at the height of my strength, but the territory had begun carrying its own weight. Hold the water, hold the hunting paths, hold the scent on the trees, hold the right to return to mating ground, hold my body from being replaced by a stronger scent after the rains. The hunts no longer existed, only to fill my stomach. Every footprint pressed into mud, every trunk cut deep by claws. Every patrol crossing black water kept my body alive inside this forest a little longer. And though the river still carried my scent far away during flood seasons, I had already begun feeling how quickly the rains erased it afterward. Many wet seasons had passed since the last time I crossed this entire black water route in a single night. Now the dry seasons stretched longer than before. The water dropped low enough to expose wide bands of cracked mud along the riverbanks. Roots that once stayed hidden beneath dark water now rose like black bones from an old body left beneath the heat. Some parts of the forest stood open and empty, where thick leaves once kept the ground cold and wet. The water smelled different too, thinner, less deep. Hot winds traveled farther through broken openings in the forest, and the air no longer carried the same heavy moisture from older seasons. Prey moved less predictably. Some nights, an entire stretch of river held no footsteps near the water at all. I returned to what had once been the center of my territory, while the last light still rested low across dry mud. My shoulders carried more weight now. The hind leg, injured long ago beneath the water, lowered more slowly whenever I crossed exposed roots. I no longer moved low and fluid the way I once had, when my body still fit completely into mud, water, and darkness. An old bone lay beside a fallen trunk. I bit down on it once. My teeth striking dry bone sent a sharp, hollow feeling through my jaw. The pressure no longer held firm. Too many seasons had worn the teeth down against flesh, bone, and hard shells near the river's edge. But my body still remembered this waterway. It still lived inside my steps, inside the wind, inside the dark spaces between trunks. Only now, everything had been rewritten. I passed the place where I once slept beside my mother during the first great flood season. The large tree had fallen long ago. Its rotting center now carried the smell of insects and damp fungus instead of old fir beneath the roots. Nearby water had changed direction, leaving behind a long stretch of cracked dry mud beneath the sun. Farther ahead lay the place where I lost my brother. Fewer birds called above than before. Sound no longer moved continuously through thick layers of leaves. I smelled the ground beneath my paws for a long time, but the old scent no longer rested beneath the roots. Only heat remained, and dry mud separating into thin broken plates. The old Capybara hunting pool had grown lower too. Water edges that once carried blood, cayman, and cold mud now held only shallow marsh ground. I stood beside a tree I had marked through many seasons. My claws dragged across the dark bark. The marks left behind were much shallower now. After only a few strikes, my breath grew heavy inside my throat. The forest did not fight me. It also did not try to keep me. Water continued retreating from the shallow channels. Short rains returned, then vanished again. Trees continued falling when roots could no longer hold the soft earth beneath them. Young animals still crossed the old paths. New scent covered old scent, the way fresh mud covered old tracks beside the water. The change did not exist only in the forest. It existed inside my body. A young tapir crossed dry mud one morning beneath heavy, humid heat. I followed its scent through low roots, but the distance between us no longer closed the way it once did. My hind leg grew heavier as the ground shifted from soft mud to cracked, dry earth. The tapir disappeared into low reeds before I came close enough to strike. Another time, I entered the water after movement near the riverbank. Cold, black current tightened around my chest. I could no longer hold my breath the way I once had. Climbing a slick root slope, my legs slipped through wet mud and my shoulder struck hard against a flooded trunk. Black cayman still rested along the river, eyes low and still upon dark water. It did not need to change. The river did not weaken beside me. Only my body no longer moved with the rhythm of water the way it once had. Far above the heated openings, black vultures circled low over exposed ground. They followed the scent of bodies, slowing down before the ecosystem around them. After a brief evening rain, I caught the scent of a young male on an old tree. The new smell was sharp and thick. Fresh claw marks stood higher than my head when I rose beside the trunk. Torn bark still bled wet sap. I clawed back across the trunk with worn claws. The marks opened shallow. I sprayed scent over the damp bark and rubbed my cheeks against the trunk for a long time, but rain thinned my scent faster than before. Before the patrol route was even complete, my shoulders already hung heavy as wet mud. Dusk spread low along the riverbank. The new scent no longer rested only on trees. It stood across the dry mud inside the body of a younger male. We watched each other for a long time. No long charge, no explosion of water like the territorial fights from older seasons. Only a short low growl vibrating through my throat. Old reflex tightened my shoulders, but my hind legs no longer held steady against dry mud. Breath left my chest hot and heavy. The younger male stood lower, broader through the shoulders. His scent carried clearly through evening wind. I raised my head once, then my shoulders slowly lowered. My body no longer wanted to drive forward. Wind from the river carried black water scent between us and continued downstream into the growing darkness. That night, I left the old patrol route. For the first time in many flood seasons, rising and falling, I did not return to market again. The river kept flowing through cracked mud banks. It held my tracks for a short while in the soft ground near the water's edge. Then the current shifted again, laying fresh mud over them until every trace slowly faded. I left the old center more slowly now. Lower than before, far away, the flooded forest near where I was born still held the sound of early night rain inside deep, wet darkness. The first rains of the season fell over the flooded forest in slow, heavy rhythm. Black water rose between massive trunks, covering old roots that pushed above the mud like dark bodies tangled together beneath the night. The smell of old earth lifted from rotting leaves soaked too long beneath water. Small drops fell constantly from roots into the still black surface below. I moved through that forest very low. Mud held my legs longer now. Every step dragged weight through my shoulders and hind hips. Fur beneath my belly kept cold rainwater longer whenever it brushed flooded pools. The night air still felt thick like many seasons before, but my body no longer held warmth the way it did when younger. Breath left slowly, deep, sometimes breaking unevenly inside a chest, tightening beneath wet fur. I was not searching for deer, not searching for capybara, not listening for water movement to guess where large fish rose near the banks. Hunger had drifted farther away than the old hunting seasons. What remained clearer was the cold, climbing upward from mud, the pressure of water around my hind legs, the heaviness gathering behind my eyes whenever rain lasted too long through the night. I only kept moving until I found roots thick enough to hide beneath. There, massive roots twisted together above black water, forming a low darkness beneath broad leaves, still holding rain overhead. I slipped slowly between the narrow spaces. My shoulders brushed cold moss along flooded bark. A small fish darted beside my front paws, leaving thin vibrations spreading through soft mud. As my body slowed, the smallest sounds of the forest became clearer. Rain against large leaves, water dripping from roots into black water. Insects repeating endlessly inside deeper darkness beyond the trunks. Tree frogs calling softly after rain, low and even, as if the whole forest breathed in the same rhythm. I lowered myself between the wet roots. Cold mud opened beneath my weight and held my belly and hind legs. Moisture gathered along my whiskers. A few drops slipped through openings in the canopy above, striking my nose before running down fur that had grown thinner and pale. Those sounds had always been there. Even before my eyes first opened, water dripping from roots, night insects vibrating around black water, the smell of wet soil and old leaves soaked beneath mud. But then, my mother's warmth still rested beside me inside the darkness. Now only a thin warmth remained inside my own body. Rain continued falling across the canopy overhead. I no longer felt hunger the way I had during older flood seasons. Clearer now was the wet fur clinging against skin, the front legs no longer lifting my body quickly, the heaviness of my hips sinking deeper into cold mud. My ears still caught the small changes inside the forest. A branch trembling somewhere beyond deeper water, a large insect brushing past my whiskers, a widening ripple when fish passed beneath flooded roots. But my ears answered more slowly now. My tail no longer twitched at every faint movement near my body. Breath continued leaving slow and heavy inside the wet darkness. The old water scent grew closer than all others. Then far away through the forest, another sound crossed the rain. Thin, broken. A young call not yet deep inside the throat. A jaguar cub calling for its mother. The sound was not meant for me. It passed through the canopy and dissolved into rain and insects covering the flooded forest. But my ears still lifted slightly. My breath paused once, only once. I did not rise, did not turn fully toward the sound. My body only remained still between the wet roots, while the distant call slowly disappeared into darkness and black water. Cub, mother, rain, cold mud, old water scent. Everything returned together beneath the same layer of sound that once covered the first nights of my life. Rain continued falling. Insects still repeated their rhythm deeper in the forest. Tree frogs kept calling beyond flooded roots. Small fish still left thin vibrations beneath dark water. No creature stopped because of the body lying here inside the mud. No great silence passed across the Amazon. No call answered for me. Only a body that would never stand again. Rainwater continued running along wet fur before dripping into mud. My scent slowly blended into the old earth surrounding flooded roots. A few strands of fur caught against rough bark. The shape of my body sank deeper into soft mud beneath my belly and hind legs. Beyond the trunks, the river still moved through darkness. Farther away, another young jaguar was still calling for its mother, somewhere inside the first rains of the season. The cycle never closes with words, only with sounds repeating around black water, with the smell of old earth, with old darkness, and with the last small warmth slowly leaving a body, returning itself to mud, flooded roots, and the forest that continued breathing through the rain-filled night.